Thank you for coming. I'm George Hutchinson, doing the introduction. I'm in the Department of Literatures and English, and I direct the Knight Institute as well. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayagohono nation. The Gayagohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayagohono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayagohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I want to mention that the M.H Abrams visiting professorship was established in 2006 by Stephen H. Weiss, class of 57, in honor of Meyer H. Mike Abrams, the late class of 1916 professor of English, and one of our most illustrious, who taught here beginning in 1945. And I don't know when he technically retired. He was still lecturing into this century. And in fact, I came here in 2012, and I heard him give a lecture on the 4th dimension of a poem, somewhere in one of these halls, when he was, I think, 102 years old, but he passed away a few years ago. Okay, Fred Moten is professor of performance studies at New York University and distinguished professor emeritus at the University of California, Riverside. He previously taught at Duke, Brown, and the University of Iowa. His work traverses the fields of Black studies, poetics, critical theory, music, and visual culture. Can everyone hear me? Okay. It has introduced and or bent to new uses all sorts of tropes that have made their way into the vocabulary of contemporary criticism and theory. His first book, In the Break, of 2003, blazed like a long-tailed comet in the firmament of Black studies, arguing that all Black performance, broadly considered, is improvisation, and much else beside that. This has remained a central tenet of his thought and practice, one that he poses against European philosophical traditions' emphasis on fixity, analytical compartmentalization, the division of subject from object, and his notion of normative personhood and political subjectivity, all of which he argues are implicated in the career of anti-Blackness. This trajectory of unfolding the implication of the Black radical tradition is expanded upon in the 3-volume series, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, which came out from Duke Press in 2017 and 2018 with Black and Blur, Stolen Life, and The Universal Machine. His work repeatedly challenges the claims to universality of Eurocentric philosophy from Kant to Arendt and Levinas, at the same time evading a merely counter or reactive movement, instead turning often to Black music and performance for models of alternatives, eruptions within yet partly independent of what Gwendolyn Brooks might have referred to as the Western field. Black studies, he has written, and I'm quoting, is a dehiscence at the heart of the institution on its edge. Broken, coded documents sanction walking in another world while passing through this one, graphically disordering the administered scarcity from which Black studies flows as wealth. In medicine, I looked it up. Dehiscence is a word I wasn't familiar with. It refers to a rupture from within, as in the case of a surgical wound. In botany, it refers to an organ opening up by its own means, like a seed pod. Both usages seem to pertain. His work in pedagogy challenged the Academy's service to capitalist socioeconomic formations, most notably in the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, a work written with his collaborator of many years, Stefano Harney, going back to his undergraduate years at Harvard, I believe. Is that right? Professor Moten has also been a prolific poet. His books in this mode include Hewson's Tavern, B. Jenkins, The Field Trio, The Little Edges, The Service Porch, and All That Beauty, all published between 2009 and 2019. And with Wu Tsang, he has published a collaborative research/experimental work titled Who Touched Me? If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution. Professor Moten has been awarded fellowships from both the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. In fact, he's on a MacArthur Fellowship right now. He has won the Stephen Henderson Award for Outstanding Poetic Achievement by the African American Literature and Culture Society. His book of poetry, The Field Trio, won the LA Times Book Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Award. And he won a Roy Lichtenstein Award from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. Please join me in welcoming Fred Moten.
Thank you so much, Professor Hutchinson. I want to truly and genuinely thank everyone here at Cornell. It's been a really enjoyable and illuminating semester. I've had such a good time. Both my classes have just been a pleasure, but at the same time, an illuminating pleasure. I feel like having had the chance to come back and teach poetry again, both the writing of it and the reading of it, has sort of ruined me. I don't know how I'm going to go back to the life I had known before, at least in the classroom. But I'm happy about that. And I also want to especially thank my old dear friends, Mary Pat Brady and Kate McCullough, who have hosted me and indulged my weird combination of late hours and early hours as I made the commute from New York City. It's been such a great thing to be able to spend time with them, so I thank them very much. Okay, so what I want to do today, I always feel like I don't have enough, and then it turns out that I generally have too much, so I'm trying to avoid the terrible impulse to offer prefatory disclaimers for what I'm about to do to you. But there are some that I have to mention. The first part of it is that the work that I've been doing, much of the work for the last 7 or 8 years, has been part of a project that I've come to call hesitant sociology. And hesitant sociology is a reversal of the title of a 1905 essay by W.E.B. Du Bois called Sociology Hesitant. I'll speak more about that essay in a minute, but the work that I'm going to present to you now is certainly a part of that sort of ongoing project, which paradoxically seems further away from completion the closer I get to completing it. And it seems also, in a weird way, not to quite want to coalesce into anything like a single book. And now I don't even think it will coalesce into anything like the illusion of a single authored book. Some of what I'm going to say today, in fact, is really very much bound up with my ongoing collaboration with Stefano Harney and some lectures specifically that we're going to give next week in California. So in a way, you could almost say that the essay I want to offer you today is its other half, probably also its better half, is in Stefano's head right now, wherever he might be. Maybe we'll figure out a way to bring them together at some point. And then let's see. The other thing I guess I would say is that this particular essay begins with a couple of stories that I have to tell. One of them is just, again, a story of my own intellectual formation. When I was a sophomore at Harvard in 1982, I took a class called Modern American Poetry from Helen Vendler, and that was the class in which I first started to read Wallace Stevens. And he's been in my head in a very uncomfortable way, for, I don't know, 40 years now. I'm not trying to get him out of my head. He's been there long enough so that there's nothing I can do about it now. But I am interested in trying to bend him in certain directions that he probably would not have wanted to go. And in particular, I want to see if, I don't necessarily care about bending him in the direction of a kind of refusal of the kind of casual anti-Blackness that undergirds not only his poetry, but some of what he's said and some of his relations with other poets, particularly Black poets, insofar as he had anything like a relation. The infamous story of his, sort of brutal dismissal of Gwendolyn Brooks's presence at the National Book Awards is just a case in point. But I think this attitude carries through his poetry in ways that might in fact indicate that a similar attitude or a larger version of that attitude is all but endemic to the general field of modern or modernist American poetry. But I got to deal with Stevens, he's a problem. And the problem that I'm dealing with today specifically is that rather than simply allowing me to then see someone like Baraka as an antidote to Stevens, the problem is that I see Baraka through Stevens. And I don't want to disavow that. I don't want to reverse it, but I want to exacerbate it, right? In a way that will allow perhaps a seeing of things, or even maybe more radically a non-seeing of things that he might never have imagined, and that the figure of the poet might never be able to imagine. And the second story is a better story, I think. It has to do with something that happened when I taught at Duke. It's probably something that occurred in 2009, I believe. It's a really extraordinary occasion in which undergraduate literature students had organized a reading, an amazing double bill of Norbesi Philip, who's coming here, I think, in a couple of weeks, and Amiri Baraka. And it was, for me, a kind of epical event. By that time, Nate Mackey had moved to Duke. So I'm sitting in a room with like 12 other people next to Nate Mackey, listening to Philip read from Zong, and then listening to Baraka. And they both were beyond amazing. It really transformed the way I was thinking about poetry, to hear them. And there was a moment, I think, when after Baraka read, because he was the final reader, he read the poem that I'm going to play for you in a few seconds. This poem called Something in the Way of Things in Town. And I just realized I did not turn this on, so I hope people in the outside world could hear me before. But it was so great. His reading was amazing. We were talking about it in class. I was trying to talk about it with folks today in my class. I've always thought that poetry, at least for me as a writer of it, that the ideal condition is one in which somehow your breath and your eye and your ear and your mind are aligned. That alignment doesn't necessarily need to be one of like absolute sort of lockstep alignment, but an alignment or an entanglement that is in a certain sense reminiscent of the modes of entanglement that we might associate with a musical ensemble. It's when you get all that stuff together, it's so rare. Often you're scrambling to try to get one element up to speed with the other elements. You stumble over your own words. It felt like what Baraka had done in this reading and in this poem, he'd made the poem in which everything lined up for him. And it is, in my opinion, I don't want to say it's his greatest poem, but it's my favorite of his poems. And so when I went up to him after the reading, I said, man, you were on fire. You were great. And he looked at me and he said, really? Because sometimes I wonder if I've ever done anything at all. And I was like dumbfounded. Because there was this moment, right, in which that whole evening, that reading, culminating in his reading, had renewed the intensity of my romance with poetry. So that for him to ask that question, rather than it just being a moment in which I would reassure him, it kind of became a moment in which I said, well, I need to know why it is that he's asked that question. So this talk is kind of an attempt to begin to address why it is that I think he might have asked that question. But I'll begin with playing this great performance of the poem from, I believe it's 2008, with the great saxophonist Rob Brown. The poem was originally lyrics for a cut on an album called Phrenology by The Roots. And that's a 2002 version. I just love this one better, more. So I'm gonna play it now. So the first detour is through Du Bois, and particularly through the readings of Du Bois's essay that R.A. Judy and Nahum Chandler offer. Maybe the problem is simply looking at, which is to say listening to, Black folks. How do we engage the out-circularity of that perception? Its difficult pleasures of return and syntax. Its embedded, imperceptible hesitations and miniature seismic events. Its dyslexic and hyperlexic scratches and scars. Du Bois addresses this question in an extraordinary paper written in 1905 called Sociology Hesitant, where he writes, "The Congress of Arts and Sciences at St. Louis last summer served to emphasize painfully the present plight of sociology. For the devotee of the cult made the strange discovery that the further following of his bent threatened violent personal dismemberment. His objects of interest were distributed quite impartially under some 6 of the 7 grand divisions of science. Economics here, ethnology there, a thing called sociology hidden under mental science, and the things really sociological ranged in a rag bag and labeled social regulation." End quote. It's not trivial that the things really sociological are arranged in or under the rubric of regulation. The trajectory of things in this text continues by way of Du Bois's reading of Auguste Comte, The Prophet. He writes, "The prophet really had a vision of 2 things, the vast and bewildering activities of men and lines of rhythm that coordinate certain of these actions. So he said, quote, now in the inorganic sciences, the elements are much better known to us than the whole which they constitute, so that in that case we must proceed from the simple to the compound. But the reverse method is necessary in the study of man and society. Man and society as a whole being better known to us and more accessible subjects of study than the parts which constitute them. End quote. Bewildering activities and lines of rhythm are the artists, say Mondrian's, about whom a little bit more later, constant study. That study takes the form and enters into the scene and life of forms of abstraction. Here, a certain dehiscence, I love that word, so I use it as many times as I can. Or better yet, a contrapuntal interplay of lines and of lines in human activities takes shape or form, or shape as the form of the encounter or of encountering. Du Bois decries what he calls the Comtean abstraction of society from human action, not only as a form of thingly congealment, but also as a calculative regulation of the incalculable. He moves against the overly simple positivist backbeat, sociology's increasingly unsubtle forgetting of the practically divine left hand. It's just that the phenomenological doesn't work either. This is the general problematic of regard. Can the subject, in his exalted degradation, regard himself? Advanced lyric poetry has become a kind of ritualized enactment of embarrassment. Such embarrassment is a profoundly and paradoxically communicable, perhaps even heritable kind of sterility. It's not shared and differentiated so much as cloned and traded. It is a matter of relations, basis, and individuation as opposed to communicability's anti-ontological spread and diffusion. Its dual implication of permeability and inseparability. It's the difference between in and that mirrors that between in and out. At stake, however, is also what, quote, what Du Bois says Comte was strangely hesitant as to the real elements of society which must be studied. Were they men or cells or atoms or something subtler than any of these? Apparently, he did not answer, but wandered on quickly to a study of society. Du Bois continues, and yet society was but an abstraction. It was as though Newton, noticing falling as characteristic of matter and explaining this phenomenon as gravitation, had straightway sought to study some weird entity known as falling, instead of soberly investigating things which fall. So, Comte and his followers noted the grouping of men, the changing of government, the agreement in thought, and then instead of a minute study of men grouping, changing, and thinking, proposed to study the group, the change, and the thought, and call this new thing society. End quote. Comte's hesitancy at the identification and isolation of the proper unit of measure or analysis is like the intractable problem of the truly elementary particle. While it is a limit for continually re-emergent positivism, it also might help us to get at the distinction between fact and facticity if we think facticity in a kind of heretically Heideggerian way as force in nothingness. We'll have to think hard in order to tease out the implications of this itinerant hesitation in the face of the real things. Independently of any defense of positivism's indefensible incarceration of truth in its objects, a question arises concerning the persistent interinhabitation of things and the thingly, constantly newly created ensemble called society. At stake is a relation between dance, dancer, and dancing that moves by way of interplay rather than eclipse, even in the midst of recognizing how lines of rhythm bear the trace and intimate the dismemberment that the resistant contrapuntal membership that comprises and is comprised by human action calls into being. There's turbulence in Du Bois's text, a kind of air pocket formed between the valorization of things that fall over falling and the valorization of grouping, changing, and thinking over the group, the change, and the thought. Following Du Bois's agitated trajectory induces another vertigo, but maybe what's at stake is, in the first instance, a displacement of the fall, and in the second instance, a forgetting of the things that group, change, and think. Du Bois's attempts at calculation also fall short. This fallenness in Du Bois is located where the paraontological difference comes online. And actually, I have to take a 2-minute aside since I'm here to say something about the paraontological difference. So, from my perspective at least, the term paraontology was introduced to me by Nahum Chandler. I later came to know, as a function of trying to read and keep up with his work as well as with R.A. Judy's work, that paraontology is a term that can be traced back to the important and importantly infamous German philosopher Oscar Becker. I guess a little while ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Nahum Chandler was here at Cornell and gave a talk on paraontology in which he seemed to be somewhat annoyed by the fact that my use of the term deviated from his use of the term, which indicated a difference between his desire for what he called a perennial scholarship, and what appears to be my desire to be merely fashionable. And you know, I have to say, he got it right. I've always I've always only wanted to be merely fashionable, and I've always been concerned with work, particularly in the realm of art, that has ordinarily been relegated to the status of the merely fashionable. Adorno wrote a really interesting and evil essay called Perennial Fashion, Jazz. And ever since then, I've always wanted to not only be fashionable, but to imagine there's really ultimately no reason to offer a simple distinction between the perennial and the fashionable anyway. And years of watching Project Runway have only confirmed this formulation for me. So I just want to acknowledge that I do use that term paraontology different than Nahum Chandler does. And at the same time, I want to continue to acknowledge, as I always have, that the first person I ever heard utter it was him. Okay. Now, what I think I want to mean by it is I want to see it as a kind of vestibular term that would have finally, at the end of the day, approached something that we might call the anti or the anti-ontological. Or, even better, if you have a friend who's from southern France and she ever utters the word anthology for you, she'll pronounce it ontology, at which point then you can even say that what you really want from the paraontological is for it to achieve the status of the anthological. You just say it ontological like your friend from southern France. The anthological, right? What's at stake is why it is that the status of the ontological is consistently both refused to and refused by modalities of social existence in which, right, the status of the individual is also refused, right? Okay. So how do we come to get at, how do we come to understand this beautiful anomaly that we might call the anthological, right? Which avoids and also is excluded from the precincts of being precisely insofar as it avoids and is excluded from the precincts of the individual. This is the problem that Du Bois is concerned with, I think, in this essay, and it's also the problem that ultimately Baraka is concerned with in this poem. Okay. All right, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, but I guess I did. Another way is to consider that Du Bois reinitializes the Kantian distinction between the descriptive and the teleological. recovering contrapuntal registers in his own regulative attempts to critique regulation. This is all to say that hesitation is the name of the underground club where pinpoint description and metaphysical homelessness, seemingly countable things and uncountable and accounted for humans hit the floor at the sudden rise of a newly given tune that might have been called phenomenological sociology. This is another quote from Du Bois. Thus, were we well started toward metaphysical wanderings, studying not the things themselves, but the mystical whole, which it was argued bravely they did form because they logically must. And to prove this imperative, there was begun that bulky essay in descriptive sociology, which has been the stock in trade of formal treatises in this science ever since. And what is descriptive sociology? It is a description of those thoughts and thoughts of things and things that go to make human life in an effort to trace in the deeds and actions of men great underlying principles of harmony and development, a philosophy of history with modest and mundane ends rather than eternal teleological purpose. Okay. It's a critique of a certain kind of Kantian metaphysics. And he wants to approach something that seems to be something that seems to be gestured towards by positivism, right? Which wants to take into account things in their specificity, but which does so in a way that subordinates those things to the idea of a teleological purpose. That tangle is what it is that Du Bois is attempting to disentangle in this essay. And okay, I'm having that bad thing in which I just want to say that I want this to be the last time I ever read an essay in front of people. It's a really, truly unnatural phenomenon. Because y'all could have read it yourself, you know what I'm saying? But, and the horrible part about it is, having written it, it gives me the impression that I could talk about it so much better if we were just hanging out, you know? And so what that makes me want to do is constantly interrupt myself. And then I start reading the essay again, and all of a sudden it becomes this series of redundancies. I just said, so I'm trying to keep myself from going off script, because the script seemingly has everything, but it doesn't, right? Because it's not as good as it would be if we were just able to hang out. One way to think of it is that the emergence of a kind of anti and anti-phenomenological sociology is that as the emergence of a kind of anti and anti-phenomenological sociology, Black poetry moves outside the structures that, say, Marjorie Perloff would recognize as phenomenological shame in the work of Bernstein or Silliman, and that Helen Wendler recognizes as phenomenological exaltation in the work of Stevens, this kind of euphoria that Stevens sort of enters into as a poet when the constant oscillation between the valorization of imagination over reality becomes a kind of, it's as if it transports him into a new dimension, right? In which the constant staging of that conflict becomes some new, almost some new altered state of mind, right? That produces a kind of poetic ecstasy. It's something, it's not so much a disordering of the senses, but a disordering of sense. But it does correspond, and that's a phrase of Abrams, and it does correspond, I think, in a certain way to the making or the production at the level of content of something like what I think he means by the poetic fourth dimension. Although I'm still thinking about it, I guess. Another way to think of it is that there is an aesthetic grounded in the materiality of eruptive itinerancy that takes the attempt to regulate the waywardness as the scene of its proliferate, profligate forms. To know and to let persist this paradoxical madness of and in the work is neither simply an effect of sovereignty, nor a matter of intention. At stake, rather, is the improvisational, appositional invention of thrown things. Another way to think about it is this, that there is an intimation in Du Bois, at once a muting and mutation, at once an amplification and translation, of an ongoing, ungendering refusal of that Hegelian alterity or objecthood, even unto death, that the model of the manned-up black intellectual from Douglas through Du Bois himself to Fanon desires, but which has always been through even more than against him in the dispersion, more than the thwarting of his will, refused. We can already see, in other words, how Du Bois will persist in a general claim upon refusal that Fanon will amplify. On the other hand, Husserl, and for that matter Heidegger, Arendt, and Levinas, could not sustain apposition to the impossible interplay of eugenics and the desire for inclusion that drives the history of philosophy. Du Bois gives us what might be called the ghost of a chance by positing the workings of chance in relation to those who, as Hortense Spillers once said, never had a prayer. And so he proceeds to the final few lines of his essay. What I'm trying to say is, Du Bois keeps finding the irregular, and he finds hope in the irregular. Okay? And at the same time, there's another philosophical tradition which basically, whose relation to the irregular is one of eugenics. And there are people who take up that philosophical tradition in the interest of a refusal of the eugenic, and they replicate the very terms of the eugenic. Okay. And what Du Bois wants to do is to leave. It's not that he doesn't have that regulative impulse in his own work. It's just that he wants to leave open the possibility that maybe that something might come of the irregular. This is the way in which I think it might be said that this essay in 1905, which will take up this question of the irregular in the terms of chance and randomness, is a really necessary precursor to all the work that he does and that then culminates in the 1935 book, Black Reconstruction. So this is the last few bits of Du Bois's Sociology Hesitant. Suppose now we frankly assume a realm of chance. What then is the program of science? Looking over the world, we see evidence of the reign of law. As we rise, however, from the physical to the human, there comes not simply complication and interaction of forces, but traces of indeterminate force until in the realm of higher human action, we have chance. That is, actions undetermined by and independent of actions gone before. The duty of science, then, is to measure carefully the limits of this chance in human conduct. It's as if Du Bois is having an argument with the Merovingian in that restaurant, right? Remember, he's like, causality, you know? Du Bois is like, there's something, right? You know, okay. Now, the question is, what form does chance take? Okay. Or, the secondary question would be, does chance take form? Okay. In other words, for the intellectual, for the sociologist, and also to a large extent, for the freedom fighter, there's this tremendous desire for chance to take a form, right? To incarcerate chance in form, right? So Du Bois will ask us, what form does chance take? And and luckily for us, chance answers, I might not take a form at all. Okay. Anyway. He continues, that there are limits is shown by the rhythm in birth and death rates and the distribution by sex. It is found further in human customs and laws, the forms of government, the laws of trade, and even in charity and ethics. As, however, we rise in the realm of conduct, we note a primary and a secondary rhythm. A primary rhythm, depending, as we have indicated, on physical forces and physical law, but within this appears again and again a secondary rhythm, which, while presenting nearly the same uniformity as the first, differs from it in its more or less sudden rise at a given tune, in accordance with prearranged plan and prediction, and in being liable to stoppage and change according to similar plan. An example of primary uniformity is the death rate. Of secondary uniformity, the operation of a woman's club. To confound the two sorts of human uniformity is fatal to clear thinking. To explain them, we must assume law and chance working in conjunction. Chance being the scientific side of inexplicable will. Sociology, then, is the science that seeks the limits of chance in human conduct. Consider that it is the physics of the woman's club that gets us here, there, and everywhere. If I say that the fifth paper of Einstein's Annus Mirabilis is sociology hesitant, it is not to position Du Bois's accomplishment as an addendum, but rather to mark it as a portal towards the all of general relativity and the off and unruly nothing of quantum mechanics in their contradictory congress, which will have been best understood not as unification, but generative dispersal and disbursal, a project of and projection that, having assumed a realm of chance in physics, is concerned with and is involved in the question of the limits of chance in human action, that not only anticipates a problematic of chance at the subatomic and cosmological levels that led Einstein to disavow the revolution that he initiated when he took quanta to be real and not merely mathematical objects, but also a prospect of anti-particulate anarchy in social existence that disrupts the self-determination of the subject that is given in Kant's metaphysical elaboration of Newtonian physics, where determinism and sovereignty are linked to the metaphysical position of the one, the individual, the elemental unit. If that unit is man, the problematic doubling, the topological fold or cut is given in a kind of grandeur, as that animating difference between subject and object of whose impossible reconciliation we dream, especially in the 20th century, as phenomenology offers methodological cover and kinship to philosophy, sociology, and psychology by way of what Kant calls the metaphysics of morals, which structures the work of those that Du Bois identifies as having, quote, insisted that we must study men because men are the greatest things in the known universe, and they have also fearlessly accepted the fact that the ought is the greatest thing in human life. But if that unit is mere object, a note, a syllable, a man, the fold or cut and all the chance and chances that it brings is harder to discern through the continually reestablished assumption of the object's irreducible simplicity. Assumed simplicity is troubled not only by a degenerate difference internal to the unit, but also a constantly regenerate social permeance and augmentation, which together give the mystery of chance in incompleteness. Because Du Bois strains against his own classicism to find the incalculable in the group, even as he elsewhere and programmatically links it to a randomness or a modality of chance that is given in and as the free-willed human individual, he allows and requires us to consider that perhaps chance is not the scientific side of inexplicable will. Inexplicable will turns out to be pure and therefore innumerable energy. Du Bois tries to organize a conflict of the sovereignties, God's and that of free individual human wills, which are conceived of as the basic units of sociological analysis. He aligns free wills with practices in society or the social as effects of metaphysical wandering. It is the distinction between physics and metaphysics that he truly wishes to maintain and clarify. He desires a physical sociology. But what if a physical sociology, in the absence of a basic unit of analysis, and in the complex common presencing of analysis or criticism as improvisational, which is to say, forward-moving, retro-projective aesthetic practice, veers towards physical sociality, the matrix, the woman's club? How can one not think that Du Bois had been reading Max Planck? Is this intermittent controlling energy that he cites quantum? It's not that the critique of positivism isn't right. It's that nevertheless, sociology must hesitate at the parts which constitute. Du Bois' essay is ruled by a kind of suggestive ambivalence, not indirectness, but a kind of double directionality, as if cut by and or folded onto itself by chance's law. It is against the backdrop of these questions that that Baraka's tune arises. Emeritus Baraka's poetry is committed to the problem and the practice of what he calls social development. This is evident in the late poem called Something in the Way of Things in Town. The evidence is rhythmic, which is manifest in Baraka's oral performances of it, and in what Du Bois might have called the poem's sociological hesitancy. I'm attempting to read Baraka's reading in deviant adherence to his rhythm, and then to investigate poetry's dissonant sojourn in the way of things. If it turns out that reading and listening to Baraka requires and allows us to read and listen to Stevens too, don't be surprised, because somehow this happens by way of another set of oral performances from a most unlikely and unwitting secret sharer of Baraka, Wallace Stevens, whose rent-free squat, or deeper still, colonial settlement in my head is cause for aching consternation. Why can't I quit him? Can Baraka quit him? What is it when we speak of certain entanglements of late work, certain non-local duets of certain interior paramours? Are these paramours Diderots? What cave, what rock, what black snowman, what Afro-Buddhist river in Connecticut? I want to consider an indeterminacy that makes its way through things, or an indeterminacy of things that constitutes the physical basis of their incalculability, or the entanglement of nothingly indeterminacy and incalculable rhythmic action. What happens when we put nothing in the way of things? What happens when the metaphysical foundations are thoroughly shaken? If Baraka opens onto a realm of ethical examination that Stevens can barely mime, it is, at least for me, an opening that Stevens' mime not only makes necessary, but illuminates. And implicit in what I'm saying there is, Du Bois is really critical of sociology's fall into metaphysics, which he associates with some notion of society or some idea of a mystical whole. And what I want to suggest is that the metaphysics is given not only in the idea of the mystical whole, but also in the idea of the individual unit. They're both metaphysical constructs. And something like a movement against the grain of those metaphysical constructs is given in the invocation of this notion of a secondary rhythm, which he associates again with the woman's club. I've also been considering Chandler's exhaustive scholarship on what he calls the interlocution between Du Bois and Max Weber. No one ever could or would want to challenge Chandler's data. Certainly mine is so imperfect as to not even aspire to the name, but I am more attuned perhaps to the disordering folklore of the senses, which might be said to move in proximity to the incalculable and also to the evident when color is involved. At stake is not only the data that corresponds to the color line, but also that which is visualized, as it were, in color, as in Du Bois's celebrated graphic data visualizations, recently recovered and represented by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russer, and which can be said to constitute his taking of a place in, or his displacement of the early history of abstraction in modern art. The trouble with Du Bois is that when you think of him alongside Weber and or Einstein, eventually it requires thinking of him alongside Mondrian as well. The visualizations require some consideration of how disorder, indeterminacy, and the imperfect might go together. And happily, Judy has initiated just such an inquiry in his really great new book, Sentient Flesh. Like Stevens, Judy suggests that the imperfect, which is so hot in us, is manifest in flawed words and stubborn sounds, to quote Stevens. Maybe that's where the hesitation comes in. a necessary hesitation, a syncopation, a rhythming in the swirl that marks where imperfect data is visualized with such generative imperfection that we come to know better about not knowing. At stake might be neither falling nor things that fall, but the deep and constantly differentiated generality of fallenness which we live to study. So I've been wanting to reverse Du Bois while still following him, to imagine a sociology that hesitates, that has rhythm, that sings and dances in a common fallenness, looking with rather than at another attunement, a hesitation of breath, as in Charles Olson's Poetics, perhaps, as opposed to the headlong, straight-ahead rush of positivism. I guess I was thinking that it was really sociology's refusal to hesitate that's been bugging Du Bois, and that his recourse to poetry was always a kind of under-sociological expression of that frustration. Here again is where Baraka comes along. Okay. Now, just to clarify one thing, what I'm suggesting here, okay, is that Du Bois actually, even though he's critiquing the hesitation that sociology makes at paying attention to things which fall, or the men that group, okay, what he actually wants to advocate for is another or a different hesitation, a double hesitation, one that would hesitate, I think, finally, not only at individual things, not only at large universalizing abstractions, but also at the idea of individual things. Okay. What that double poetry then, I think, becomes the place where that double hesitation can take place, where that alternative rhythm can be given. Okay. I want to give another version of it in an earlier poem by Baraka, because the real problem will now become this, right? If poetry is the place where we can hesitate both at the idea of the individual thing and the idea of the mystical whole, okay, what happens how is that undermined by the intensity with which we begin to think of poetry as the activity in which is determined fundamentally by two activities, as an activity determined by two activities, seeing and naming. Do seeing and naming reinstantiate metaphysics in poetry? Right? And how does one combat that when one has such a deep commitment to the idea that what the poet does, what justifies the poet, as a person, what justifies poetic activity is that they see and name. Especially when what they see and name is never seen and never named. Right? Like, for instance, conquest, genocide, right? What the poetic impulse at that moment, like why we love Baraka, is that he sees and names these things. And at the same time, what emerges in Baraka's work is the beginning of a question as to whether or not the very idea of seeing and naming are all bound up with the brutalities of what it is that he sees and names. Here's Baraka early on in the full flower of his absolute confidence in seeing and naming. It's a poem from the 60s called, Return of the Native. Okay. It's a great poem. It's a poem about Baraka leaving Greenwich Village to return to Harlem. Problem, of course, is he's from Newark. Right? Okay. It's a preface to the actual poem called Return of the Native, which we heard him read just now. Right? In Town is a Newark poem, okay? This is a Harlem poem, but it's beautiful. Harlem is vicious modernism, bang, clash, vicious the way it's made. Can you stand such beauty, so violent and transforming? The trees blink naked, being so few. The women stare and are in love with themselves. The sky sits awake over us, screaming at us. No rain. Sun, hot cleaning sun, drives us under it. The place and placement of Black people, their heavy Egypt, weird word. Their minds, mine. The Black hope, mine, in time. We slide along in pain or too happy, so much love for us. All over, so much of what we need. Can you sing yourself, your life, your place on the warm planet Earth and look at the stones, the hearts, the gentle hum of meaning? Each thing, life we have or love is meant for us in a world like this, where we may see ourselves all the time and suffer in joy that our lives are so familiar. It's like a different poem, and it's from a different historical moment. It's still in the flush of anti-colonial optimism. And one of the things that anti-colonial optimism is, it seems to me, is it's characterized by what the great Guyanese poet Martin Carter might call involvement. Right? There's great philosopher Donald Davidson wrote this great essay once called On the Very Idea of a Conceptual Scheme. And one way to think about it, of course, is that the very idea of a conceptual scheme is endemic to the very idea of man. Okay. Which is also to say the very idea of coming into one's own as man. It's bound up with a profoundly important discourse on liberation. But the very idea of a conceptual scheme is also totally predicated on separation and totally predicated on the constant reinstantiation of the brutalities of the subject-object opposition. And what you get in the work of Martin Carter in the 1950s and the work of James Baldwin in the 1960s is this valorization of involvement over conceptual distancing. And I believe that that valorization of involvement is what's animating the return of the native. And at the same time, the return of the native's valorization of involvement is not undermined, but almost accentuated by the fact that the native in question is neither a native nor is he returning. Okay. So that this notion of placement, the place and placement of Black people, is corresponding in this really rich way with what Norbesi Philip will eventually call displace. The dissing and the distancing of place. And if you bring, so that was maybe what happened to me that night, in Durham, is that between her displace and his place and placement is spelled PLACE/MEANT. A new formulation emerges, displacement. Okay. Well, I'm almost done, I think. I hope. It's not too much more. I want to talk about these two poems and the stance of these poems, okay? Which is not really a stance at all. Waiting, not so much in vain, but on a friend, though waiting ain't quite the word. Loitering, milling, murmuring, cruising, gathering in non-observance of the strict and paradoxical ceremonies of letting the lost object go. There is no object. It can't be lost. It'll never let you go. That's why Black funerals are often juked symposia on the problem of late work. I'm interested in Return of the Native and In Town as plain song, in their urban wandering, their inventory, their close-edged displacements. You know that rap by Mos Def, Close Edge? If you Google it, you'll see a performance of it on the old Dave Chappelle show, back when there was maybe a slight redeeming quality. And it's a beautiful moment where he's just driving around like in Brooklyn somewhere, and Mos Def is in the driver's seat reciting this thing, this Close Edge. And Close Edge as a piece of poetry, it seems to me to be very much aligned with what Baraka is doing in Return of the Native, and what he sort of finds that he can't quite do anymore, right? In Town. In Town it's also a kind of tragic revelation of his own non-involvement, right? So remember what I was saying before about, it's like it's his greatest poem. It's not that he wasn't a poet before, but he'd achieved something in this poetry that most poetry never even comes close to achieving. And what it constitutes for him is, in some sense, it's an achievement that can't be separated from detachment, right? Really, it's you that get lost in all this wandering uncoordination of foot and eye, all this walking around so you can see something in the way of things that moves toward the unthinking of world. There's got to be someone who sees and names, who takes names in the interest of imminent seizure. Baraka says, I see things, I know things, and though I know nothing that you don't know, you can't call their names. What it is to take names, to call names, to investigate and indict is what animates his sense of being a poet. And who does it more thoroughly, more roughly, more constantly at odds with his own ethical well-being? It's not just strict adherence to the imperative to see and name. It's not just that strict adherence to the imperative to see and name might mean that you say the wrong thing or name the right thing, or hold what you see, even if you love it, in objecthood. But also that all this seeing and naming might amount in the end to not having done anything at all. Gideon Lewis Krauss says in relation to the Brazilian artist Paulo Nazareth, quote, the flaneur and the traveler do nothing, but they take nothing very seriously. Paulo Nazareth turns all this on its head. He does nothing and makes it into something by allowing it to remain pretty much nothing. His shows are, in fact, full of random and gratuitous elements. They comprise exclusively random elements. Are the elements of Baraka's poem also random and gratuitous, so that seeing things and seeing something in the way of things comes against the backdrop of having taken nothing seriously? Taking nothing seriously is concern for social fabric. Okay. Taking no thing, okay. Taking the refusal to separate things from things seriously is a consideration of social fabric. It's a continuation of something like what we might call a field theory of the social. Okay. What is the way of things? What if it is a radical refusal of the distinction between context and content? And what if the way is given in and as Plainsong's foregiven bearing of and toward polyphony? Content and context are the fabric that is woven in that bearing. What it is to see something in the way of things and to name it is not so much deferred but held provisional. What is the nothing you don't know? It is an annoyingly snowmanish question that poetry takes up through the poet. What is it in this fabricant nothingness of our making and our notice to see something in the way of things? What is it to be something that sees and names something in the way of things? To see something in the way that things do, to be a thing among other things, as Fanon describes, in and as fallenness, to have fallen in and into the way of things. Is this a seeing given in and predicated upon return, so that it is not so much a sequel, but a fulfillment of Return of the Native? I believe that these are all variations on the questioning statement Baraka made to me that I have presumptuously taken also as a kind of request and a kind of warning. Sometimes I wonder if I've done anything at all. A question is stated here, it is posed, and the question concerning the very positing of the question is entangled with that concerning the position of the one who poses it. It is a matter of dislocation that works in such a way that the very impossibility of the conceptual scheme from which it has been asked becomes our rendezvous of victory. But the rendezvous was not given in and as return, but displacement,
where we fall through the classically mechanical locality of things and into nothing's non-locality, which is an open field of field. The ones who open the field, who set the terms and protocols for its cultivation, whose grounding becomes the source of our provision and our ongoing improvision, whose tilling aerates the catastrophic garden, often can't seem to believe what they have seen. And so they try to talk about it, to name it, as if it were something, as if it had been something or someone to see, as if the thing, the particle, the nice boy who smiles, having shown up in his alienation, having come into his own in injury, is not just an object, but also the skeletal self-image of the poet, who sees himself walking past himself, not smiling. They hurt him real bad, and he was gone. Baraka, the hesitant sociologist. This is where I keep trying to begin. But the terrible double shock of seeing and needing to see, as it were, Wallace Stevens in Baraka, to see them in and as the separation they have formed in my head, which we might also call mere being's separation, its various modalities of seeming benign. This repetitive finale, this endlessly repeating final soliloquy, which is sometimes called late work, shows up in my head as the contest for my head that Stevens and Baraka have been fighting for years. And all this is exacerbated by the fact that the one thing I know is that I want Baraka to win. I have preferred him, and it is that preference that lets me further know that I haven't gotten rid of the structure of the poet problem, but only changed its location. I choose Baraka again because of his dissatisfaction, the content of his discontent, which is, for Stevens, absent. It is finally neither the central mind nor a mind of winter that allows us to see the nothing that is not there relative to the nothing that is, that sustains or animates Baraka. Being there together for Baraka is not enough and is perhaps not even available. There is rather a dehiscence at the heart of being there, which authorizes the poet in his separation from what he sees, which is to separate and name, which, having never been really available to Baraka, now seems to him, insofar as he might be said all but to have it in his grasp, undesirable. What remains is that this capacity to see relatively nothing might turn toward a kind of ease with being nothing, a general involvement that poetry's incalculable but finite mass instantiates against the abstract affinity of each and every poem and each and every poet. Late Baraka is desperate, not disparate and self-congratulatory, not aerial, all proud of his poetry and the conceptual scheming that it asserts and then confirms. Rather, late Baraka suffers, which is not to be apart. To suffer is to not be apart. Okay? And what we find is that it's not that he hasn't done nothing, but that in the end, he very beautifully and devotedly has. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Hi, Fred. John McKenzie. Nice to see you again.
Hey, what's up, man?
I wanted to ask you about this paraontological and the sharing of this nothing in your work and how that sharing happens differently in poetry, in theory, and maybe if there's something in between in this experimental collaborative work you do.
Well, I did something today that I'm going to feel increasingly guilty about over the next few months, which is, but now that I did it, I guess I got to keep going with it. So, as I said, you know, maybe for me, the history of my hearing the term paraontology was totally inflected by my reading the term paraliterary as it was written by Samuel Delany. And, but I probably also mistook Delany's meaning as well as I probably mistook Chandler's. For me, I put more faith in the possible exteriority of the para than maybe Chandler does. I don't know if it's because the ontological is, again, as Stevens would say, so hot in us. I don't know if it's because the ontological is something that one might argue that we simply can't opt out of, or if it's because the ontological is so powerful that it exceeds any possible capacity to escape, so to speak. But the notion of an escape from being, which, you know, Levinas offers in early work, you know, and in work that was explicitly against the framework and against the grain of Nazism as it was rising, you know, it gave me hope, you know, even if it felt like to me a kind of underlying racism and more specifically, you know, an underlying kind of anti-blackness in Levinas, you know, but it was those great sort of dissonant figures in the history of phenomenology, who were also dissonant figures in the history of ontology that were the examples that I was trying to follow. You know, Levinas to a certain extent, Arendt in a different way, Fanon in a different way, Tran Duc Tao in a really different way, and in a way that was much more inflected than any of those three by Marxism. So you say, okay, maybe there's a way to extract ourselves from this phenomenological, ontological sort of hold that we're in. And it felt like, you know, maybe they were a little bit more aggressive about it, you know, even if maybe they weren't necessarily as rigorous about it as somebody like Derrida might be, you know, or whatever. And so in my mind, you know, being, you know, in a certain sense, enthralled, you know, by Nahum Chandler's work, which is utterly brilliant and absolutely indispensable, you know, I probably inadvertently folded him into one camp that he maybe didn't want to be folded into. And by extension, maybe would be seen to put Du Bois in a camp that he would object to as well. So, why am I saying all that? The reason I'm saying all that is because that's why reading this essay by Du Bois is so important to me. Just trying to continue to read it. I'm trying to understand it. Because it feels to me like Du Bois is anticipating the great shock to the general epistemological system that quantum mechanics produces in the 1920s between the work of Heisenberg on the one hand and Bohr on the other. He's sort of saying, you know, one way to think about it is that Du Bois is arguing that a rigorous sociology must be animated by a theory of complementarity. We have to understand how chance and law go together, okay? And we have to not be scared of indeterminacy, okay? Or even offended by indeterminacy. It appears to be the case that, like, Einstein was aesthetically offended by indeterminacy. And Du Bois is sort of, is already recognizing the importance of indeterminacy in the social arena in 1905, and it took another 20 years for physics to really come to grips with the force of indeterminacy. And when physics comes to grips with the force of indeterminacy, if it's the case that Newton's mechanics, that Newton's physics are fundamental to Kant's metaphysics, and I think they are, what we're living in right now is a moment, and it's a moment that Black studies has taken up especially, and I think it is mischaracterized when people call it an ontological turn. It's an anthological turn, but it might not even really be a turn. It's an extension of this this concern, this seeming concern with ontology is there in Black liberation theology. It's in James Cone. It's in Theodis Roberts. It's all over the place. It's been all over the place. And what Nahum has shown, like absolutely brilliantly, is it was already there in Du Bois. And you can go back further than him, right? And what's really cool is to recognize that what if this disruption of the ontological and phenomenological consensus, right, is given not only in what it is that we might call Black studies, but even more fundamentally is given in Black study, which is to say in Black sociology, right? Which is, as my friend Laura Harris would say, an aesthetic sociology. So what if all that, see now we're getting towards, we're performance studies people, John. So this moves us in that direction. So I was coming at the term paraontology with those things in mind, as in the hope of a more radical break, right? And I feel like maybe what Chandler is doing is sort of saying you're moving too fast and loose, And I have no reply other than to say I know I am. You know what I'm saying? Like I could be wrong, but it won't hurt anything if I try. Let me be weird. You be rigorous. Let me be silly, and maybe something will come from that. If any harm, if it all turns out to have been wrong, nobody gets hurt but me. Although what he would say is no, because your silly unrigorousness is so fashionable that people tend to like your ass better than they like me. Basically, and I mean. Sorry, it's getting personal. But whatever. We hurt each other's feelings. I'm sorry. I thought I was, anyway, please, yes.
Hi. Hi, I'm Kelly. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for the lecture. I have a kind of roundabout question. I was so struck by your initial description of, what it is that is wonderful about a poem when it's I think you said, sound, sense, visuality, all these things sort of working in sync. And then I was thinking about that in relation to, though, what seems very important in your work, which is dissonance and syncopation. And I'm trying to think about how to square those things. And maybe squaring is not what I should be trying to do. But, it strikes me, I really loved this distinction that you made about Baraka, about the flush of involvement and how that can really feel like when you're in a poem and it's going. And then what dissonance or syncopation or hesitation can do that is different than that feeling or creates it. So sorry, maybe this is an awful comment rather than a question. I'm just curious about where dissonance comes in, especially since I know that dissonance is so huge, both for you and also for, somebody else that you've written about quite a bit in a vexed way, which is Adorno. So I would just love to hear you talk about dissonance and syncopation.
Cool. So, I feel like, thank you so much for the question, and it helps me to clarify something, and I hope in clarifying it, I want to be doing something other than just repeating myself, because I want it to be different. I want it to be a little bit better. But there's a great musicologist and pianist named Charles Rosen. And his work, particularly his work he wrote a cool little book on Schoenberg, was really important for me. It helped me to understand something about dissonance. And my tendency, like probably some other people, is to think of dissonance as is to basically conflate dissonance with discord, right? And what Rosen says is, no,
it's almost as if in a way he does something that's similar to what it is that Du Bois is talking about. He says, let's slow down for a minute and not talk about dissonance, but let's talk about a dissonant note. And what he says is, a dissonant note is a note that must be followed by another note. Okay. So what that means that instead of talking about dissonance in terms of discord, what we can do is talk about dissonance in terms of openness or incompleteness. Okay. And to talk about dissonance in terms of incompleteness produces all kinds of interesting possibilities, but also imperatives. So, a whole lot of the way that we think about poetry and a whole lot of the ways that we think about individual poems, there's a decent part of our training which is deeply committed, even still, we don't get rid of T.S. Eliot and the New Critics just because we don't read them anymore. It's almost like because we don't necessarily read them anymore, they're even more ingrained in the way that we think about poetry and the way that we imagine a certain kind of completeness as that which is supposed to characterize the poem, the well-wrought urn, right? There's another sort of dissonant tradition in modern American poetry which tries, I think, at least to disrupt that formulation through the idea of what Duncan and Olson call an open field poetics, and that's a fundamental part of Baraka's line. Okay, but I think what's interesting is to think about if you have Malcolm X's old analytic distinction between the house Negro and the field Negro in your back of your mind as you start to think about the notion of an open field poetics. It really enriches that formulation. Because now you're talking about field hollers and work songs and the blues, and the various musics that are derived from it as also part and parcel of this history of dissonance. Or what we could call, by way of Schoenberg, the history of the emancipation of the dissonance. And then it turns out that the history of the emancipation of the dissonance is totally coterminous with the history of a certain modality of syncopation. Like, for instance, let's say that, for the sake of argument, we say that the great epical invention of, that kicked off the 20th century for American popular music is the invention of the trap set, which is a contraction for contraption, right? And what the trap set does is it allows polyphony, it allows polyrhythm to be played by one person, right? In a complicated way. And what it produces is the necessity for a drummer who is capable of creating a condition for herself or himself in which the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and neither one of them know what the left foot is doing, and all of them don't know what the right foot is doing. That's the condition of polyrhythm. One way to think about it, it's a condition of bodily incompleteness, right? And so here's where a certain incompleteness of form at the level of dissonance corresponds with a certain incompleteness of body at the level of the instrumentalist. And it feels to me like Baraka's poetry is always is concerned with that, both on a sociological level and and on an aesthetic level. And when I say that I believe that poem is a great poem, I mean to say that I think he achieves this convergence of dissonance and syncopation, right? And then the scary part of this is that the achievement leaves him feeling desperate. It feels like like how can you read, for me, it's such a beautiful poem that I don't actually even talk about it, okay? But how can you read a poem having made that poem and then say, have I done anything at all, right? So, and again, to me, that's so often there's a notion of late work that is associated with a kind of dissonance or a kind of, disordering complexity that is distilled in this highly concentrated way. And what it is that Baraka is doing is it's late work of a different order. And again, there are these tremendously almost like phantasmagorical moments in those late poems of Stevens, which are so much in my head that they just infuse everything I write. Like I'm quoting him all the time. I can't even help it, and I love that stuff. But then there's this other part of it where, like the only one I don't love is The Planet on the Table. Because he's congratulating me. Ariel was proud of his poems, right? Shut up, Ariel. Baraka's like, no, and we have to ask some questions about poetry now, and the discourse that emerges from Stevens and from the love of Stevens is still absolutely sure, okay, of the value, of being a poet and of writing poems. And Baraka's like, I gotta ask some questions about that, because I wasn't doing it just for that. So, anyway, sorry.
I have a question from our Zoom audience. Something that I was struck by in the recording of the poem is the possible reading of "in the way of" as an obstacle, or in the sense of getting in the way. How do you think about something getting in the way of things, or maybe more interestingly in terms of your essay, things getting in the way of something as opposed to nothing?
That's a really cool question. And I have to admit, I thought a little bit about the whole notion of obstruction, but I also, my own predilections made me probably subordinate that reading to the point of disappearance. And now that I gotta keep working on it, that's something that I would wanna keep working on. Because, there's some formulations that come to mind quickly, about Black life as a life of being obstructed, that could show up there, and that would be real, but I remain convinced, even beyond my own predilection, right, that notion of way and path, mode, modality, that's still for me that dominates my sense of the poem's sense, but I gotta work hard enough to the point where I can see if I can get past that dominance, because there's more to be said. There's more to be said there, and it should be said. So I'll plead, unfinishedness, but not to sidestep the question, but to say, I promise I'm gonna keep working on it. So.